Okay, let's how everyone. Today's lesson is instrumentation of IR spectrophotometry. IR spectrophotometer. IR spectra are obtained by detecting changes in transmittance or absorption intensity as a function of frequency. In UV visible spectroscopy, change in transmittance or absorption of intensity as a function of wavelengths, but in IR as a function of frequency or wave number. Most commercial instruments uh, separate and measure IR radiation using dispersive spectrometer or Fourier transform spectrometer. Um, Basic components of the instrumentation has or have radiation source, monochromator or interferometers, sample compartment, and detector. Each components have a great functional unit of the instrumentation. Without this instrumentation, the instrument cannot work effectively or correctly. We can see each components one by one. The first one is radiation source in IR spectrum is or an inert solid is electrically heated to a temperature in range of 5000 up to 200 solid inert mass emit IR radiation because of the using higher temperature. There are different radiation sources in IR radiation from this nearest global source and necromire. Each radiation source have a specific character. For example, nearest power glore is a cylinder that have 1 up to 2 millimeter diameter and approximately 20 millimeter long of rare earth oxides. The nearest glore can reach a temperature of 2200 Kelvin. The other one is silicon carbide rod that have 5 millimeter diameter and 50 millimeter long, which is electrically heated to about 1500 Kelvin. The temperature is much lower than that of nearest glore. 1100 Kelvin. It produces lower intensity of radiation than that of nearest and global source because the temperature of heating is much lower than that of the radiation source, but has a longer working life. The other component of the IR instrumentation is a monochromator. Spectrum of radiation into its component of wavelengths or frequency. The radiation source gives a radiation that have a polychromatic frequency or wave number or wavelength. This is not useful for analysis of the sample. These monochromator are used to separate or disperse a broad spectrum to a polychromatic wavelength or frequency to a monochromatic wavelength or frequency that provides a continuous series of electromagnetic radiation energy bands of determinable wavelengths or frequency range that have specific wavelengths to pass through the sample. Because the monochromator disperse the radiation source based on their wavelength or frequency to its component, and by using this monochromator we can change the exiting light and select one of the interesting wavelengths that the analyst absorb maximum absorption. This used for separation of the interest wavelengths. So that monochromator is a very important device that in spectroscopy. There are different monochromator used in IR spectroscopy. From this prism or grating are as a dispersive components used in conjunction with the variable slit mechanism and mirrors. The mirrors are used for to form triangle shape light source to parallel spectrometer because the transform for a transform spectrometer or photometer that are or the interferometer that do not use a monochromator. This prism and grating are only used for dispersive IR spectrometer. The other is interferometer that are used in FTR or Fourier transform instrument. Interferometer are FTR instrument uses a system and it collects the spectrum that pass through the sample. The most commonly used that have moving mirror, fixed and moving mirror, a fixed mirror, and a beam splitter. The energy goes from the source to the beam splitter, which splits the beam into parts. That one part moves to the moving mirror, and one part of the splitted beam moves to the fixed mirror. The moving mirror moves back and forth at a constant velocity. The two beams are reflected from mirrors and recombined at the beam splitter. The light beam that pass through the fixed mirror and the beams that pass to or transmit to the moving mirror back reflect to the beam splitter, and the beam from the moving mirror has traveled at different distance than beam from the fixed mirror, because the moving mirror have it may be compressed or elongated during their movement. As a result, the distance between the moving mirror and that of the beam splitter have a different distance, but the fixed mirror have a fixed position of from the beam splitter that have a constant distance between them. When the beams are combined, an interference pattern is created because of changing position of moving mirror. The interference is created by that of the moving mirror because changing of the position of the moving mirror. Since some of the wavelengths recombine constructively and some are combined destructively, so the constructively recombined wavelengths are passed through the sample. If the movable mirror moves away from the beam splitter at the constant speed, that means the distance between that of the beam splitter and the moving mirror increased, or the moving mirror moves away from the beam splitter. Radiation reaches the detector goes through a steady sequence of maxima and minima as the interference alternates between constructive and destructive phase. The interference pattern is called interferogram. This means that the maxima and minima of the interference is called that of interferogram. This interferogram of the recombined wavelengths that pass through the sample and eventually focused on the detector. The light that come back from the moving mirror and the fixed mirror recombined in the beam splitter, and these wavelengths are in alternative maxima and minima, either destructively or constructively, that pass through this is called interferogram, and the resulting beam pass through the sample and detector. The diagram, as we see from the diagram, a moving mirror moves back and forth. As the moving mirror moves far away from the beam splitter, the beam of light rip back to or reflect to the beam splitter, and the moving or the stationary mirrors reflect light to the beam splitter. As a result, the recombined beam of light pass through the sample in the form of interferogram, and pass to the detector and already detected in the interferogram. The interferogram or a time domain spectrum that by which time the wavelength of light reaches to the detector records the detector response changes versus time within the mirror scan. If the sample happens to absorb at this frequency, the amplitude of the sinusoidal wave is reduced by the amount of proportional to the amount of sample in the beam, because some amount of light is absorbed by the sample and the intensity of the transmitted light is reduced, so the amplitude of the wave is decreased because of decreased intensity of light because of absorption of the light by the sample. A mathematical operation known as Fourier transformation converts the interferogram, a time domain spectrum displaying intensity versus time within a mirror scan, to the final IR spectrum, that of absorption or transmission to the wave number or frequency domain, which is the familiar frequency domain spectrum showing intensity versus frequency. So the Fourier transforms converts the interferogram from time domain spectrum displaying intensity versus time within the mirror to the final frequency domain or absorption or transmission versus that of frequency or wave number domain. This is called the Fourier transform IR spectrum. The other components of instrumentation is detector. There are different detectors from this thermal detector. The first one is thermal detector. They measure the heating effect produced by IR radiation. A variety of physical property change are quantitatively determined. From this, thermocouples, thermosistors, pneumatic device. Voltage at junction of dissimilar metals. The thermosistors, electrical resistance or thermosistors, and pneumatic devices, glow detectors, expansion of non-bonding gases. The other one is, or the second detector is photon detector. Rely on the interaction of IR radiation and semiconductor material. Non-conducting electrons are excited to conducting state. Thus, the small current or voltage can be generated. This current is measured, and this current is directly proportional to the intensity of light transmitted to the detector. As a result, or finally, the detector of IR radiation or spectrum include thermal detectors that measure the heating effect produced by IR radiation or the produced heating. When the material interacts with IR radiation, they may be generate heat, or IR radiation produce heat, and this effect is measured by the detector. And these detectors are called thermal detector. This includes thermocouples, thermosistors, and pneumatic device. The other one is photo detector. This rely on the interaction of IR radiation and semiconductor material. When the analyte or the detector material are non-conducting electrons are excited to the conducting state or changed from non-conducting state to conducting state. At this time, small current or voltage can be generated. This small current or voltage can be detected, and this small current or voltage is directly proportional to the intensity of light absorbed and transmitted to the detector. FTR or Fourier transform IR radiation spectrometer detector that included deuterated triglycine sulfate and mercury cadmium telluride. Deuterium triglycine sulfate a very sensitive room temperature triglyceride sulfate. As the temperature and the polarizability of the crystals changes due to the absorption of infrared radiation, a charge is generated, which is detected by two parallel electrodes. The other detector is mercury cadmium telluride. It is a chemical compound of cadmium telluride and mercury telluride, which with it enable band gap spanning the short wave IR to the very long wave IR region.